and welcome to another Sacred Wisdom podcast. I am joined with my incredible brother Stephen today, and we are going to be talking about what existed before Tartaria. It would seem Tartaria was erased because it had so much historical influence from Hyperborea and Scythia. But there is a lot more to these civilizations than we know. And they held, or would seem that they held, these kind of technologies that we discussed previously in Sacred Wisdom podcasts. And I'm going to hand it over to Stephen because he does such a brilliant job at articulating all this incredible information to you. So, hello, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing well. Hope all's good with you, Zach.
Brilliant, Steve. All good. First of all, let's just discuss a bit about what actually existed before Tartaria and then lead it up through the civilization to the actual Tartarian when Tartaria was built, or Tartaria arose as a civilization.
So before Tartaria, or Tartary existed in northern Russia, the civilization of Scythia had existed. So simplifying that down, so you went from Scythia and then going back many thousands of years, right the way back to the period of actually 25,869 BC, is when basically the civilization of Hyperborea was destroyed, or it kind of faced pretty much cultural and scientific collapse. And from that period, there was obviously a lot of conflict, a lot of movement of different populations. But eventually, many centuries later, from the remnants of Hyperborea arose the civilization of Scythia, and then in turn arose the civilization of Great Tartaria. So that's really what took place. Now, obviously, if you go back to 25,869 BC and then bring it forward to the actual emergence of the civilization of Scythia, there was many smaller Hyperborean kingdoms that had survived the destruction of the actual unified civilization of Hyperborea. And we've got to remember that Hyperborea, during its golden age or its golden period, had existed for many aeons of time with tremendous peace and happiness and tranquility amongst its citizens. And the Hyperborean kings, the Hyperborean queens had ruled with fairness and honesty and had shown great respect to the populations of the Nordic Hyperboreans. They existed. The populations of the Nordic Hyperboreans had existed in towns and cities that were actually situated in areas that are known today to be the shorelines that are adjacent to the Barents Sea, the White Sea, the Kara Sea, the Laptev Sea, the East Siberian Sea, and the Chukchi Sea across northern Russia. And all of those locations really are part of the Arctic North Polar region, or we can call it the Arctic Circle. Now, when we actually look at this vast civilization of Hyperborea, it was far larger than Great Tartaria because it didn't just cover northern Russia. It obviously covered places that are known today as Iceland and Greenland and many other locations. The occult technology of Hyperborea was based around using what were known at the time as shining pyramids or crystal pyramids. And these were granite built, and they had different types of quartz crystal capstones. They were interplaced in key locations on geomagnetic ley lines across northern Russia, in other parts of the Arctic North Polar region, to actually draw the telluric electricity that was in the atmosphere at those times down into those pyramids that acted as electrical distributors into the towns and cities to create heating and lighting and to create a buildup of electrical energy in the capacitors on board the anti-gravity vessels that these Nordic Hyperboreans used. So we can immediately see parallels between the civilization of Hyperborea and the civilization of Great Tartaria.
So tell us more about Scythia, because this is always a missing connection between Tartaria and back to Hyperborea. So we bridge it in. So we got going up into Scythia. Let's go into Scythia and talk about that.
When we look at the civilization of Hyperborea, they were very focused on different types of somatic sound healing very similar to what was being done in the healing temples across Great Tartaria and northern Russia. But when it comes to the Scythians, they also were very much into the use of music and the combining music with incense and really trying to actually create a restorative process where their own physical and biological health was being protected. So many of the Scythian Aryans became proficient in the playing of the golden lyre, also known as the golden harp, in their villages and towns across the Pontic Caspian steppe in northern Ukraine and southern Russia. With these kinds of incredible musical instruments, the Scythian Aryans also played ornately engraved iron pipes, copper flutes, huge oxen horn drums, gourd flutes, ligneous fiddles, and oblong-shaped wooden and iron resonators that emitted specific types of harmonic patterns that were covered in sounding membranes. So they were very much into the use and the continuation, really, of the cymatic-based healing that had gone on amongst the Nordic Hyperboreans. And so the Scythian Aryans really became those individuals who were the genetic inheritors of that cymatic-based occult technology, albeit it had regressed over many centuries, over many generations, after the collapse of the civilization of Hyperborea. We have to also remember that the Scythian Aryans also used specific types of minerals such as emerald and also heliodor, which are kinds of beryl, as they emanated a flickering luminescence inside the deity temples, which were used to combine the luminescence of such crystalline substances with the incense and the various harmonic patterns of sound that were being emitted from the musical instruments these Scythian Aryans were playing. So you can see that one of the things that really was continued and was really a big cultural influence from the civilization of Hyperborea into the civilization of Scythia in the Pontic Caspian steppe, and all the way into the emergence of the civilization of Great Tartaria, northern Russia, was the use of cymatic-based healing and musical tones, harmonic patterns to create and elicit a sense of biological restoration and optimal medical health amongst the adults and the children of those different civilizations. But then you've got this correlation. So in Hyperborea, they were using quartz crystals, the capstones of the shining pyramids and the crystal pyramids. Then you look at the civilization of Scythia, and they're using emerald and heliodor. So you then go from there to Great Tartaria, and they were obviously using different types of quartz in the actual stained glass windows of their healing temples. And I've already, in a previous Sacred Wisdom podcast, we've discussed that. And so you can see there's a lot of correlations, music, different types of luminescence based on chromatic wavelengths in different crystal substances. Again, we have similarities there, cultural influences. I think the key point is that the civilization of Hyperborea, as with Great Tartaria, were really civilizations that were much more involved in the development of occult technology, whereas the Scythian Aryans really were a culture that had arisen out of the complete obliteration of much of Hyperborea. There would have been so many different climatic changes and atmospheric upheaval that had taken place after the destruction of Hyperborea.
Do you know how it was destructed, Hyperborea? Have you seen, or is there evidence of how that was destructed?
Well, geologically, we know in prehistory that across northern Russia, going up obviously into the polar Urals and the northern Urals, and then obviously and out into the Barents Sea, the White Sea, the Kara Sea, the Laptev Sea, the eastern Siberia Sea, and the Chukchi Sea, along the shorelines of northern Russia, huge amounts of seaquake activity, and many of the Arctic Russian islands there in the prehistory were actually destroyed and sank. We also have to remember in prehistory, going back many, many aeons of time, that Greenland was far bigger than it is today. We know that Iceland geologically is reported to have been at least 5 times larger than it is today as a landmass, which would make it probably slightly larger, if not approximately the same size as the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And we have to also remember you've got an island like Spitsbergen. Spitsbergen was known to be far larger than it is today. And in those areas, going out into the Norwegian Sea, up into the Arctic Ocean, and even around the Baltic Sea, there were small northern island chains there that you could literally take boats to these various island chains and get to the main land masses. And all of that was completely destroyed. That obviously created mass tidal activity and obviously coastal attrition, causing the mass collapse of cliffs, the washing away of coastlines or shorelines. And we're talking over obviously thousands of years this was going on, plus obviously volcanic activity. And you combine all these different factors, you can see why these were some of the main reasons why the civilization of Hyperborea was destroyed. You have to also remember that the Greek myths talk about Hyperborea having the eternal spring. So if we imagine in the Arctic North Polar region, we can imagine in northern Russia, in the polar Urals and the northern Urals, and obviously the Ural Mountains in Greek mythology were known as the Riphaean Mountains. So these areas were seen as highly fertile. They had temperate climates, vast amounts of fields and meadows were planted, and they were growing fruits, vegetables, and cereal crops. So these were very fertile, very abundant, large expanses. Then geographically, because of all these changes, many of the populations had to start moving into southern Russia. They had to move into parts of Eastern Asia. So there was a lot of movement of populations and tribal groups, different societies and communities had to get out of those regions because there was huge changes in the climate. And, you go back, there are so many accounts in world folklore of the Arctic North Polar region actually being this massive geographical expanse, including, as I've said, Greenland and Iceland and Spitsbergen, obviously northern Russia, the Arctic Northern Islands, all along those shorelines going right the way out. As being very fertile, abundant places where there were large populations. We know, for example, that in the remote expanse of the Chersky Range and the Kolyma Mountains in northeastern Russia, not that far from the Kamchatka Peninsula, there were huge amounts of orchards there. There was literally thousands of acres of fruits and vegetables that once grew in those areas. Now, of course, it's so frigid, so cold. There's such, long term throughout the year, sub-zero temperature.
I think we've been kind of primed in today's age to believe that, these climates will always be forever, but people need to understand that always climates will change all throughout time. Right. England might be a very cold place in years to come. It might be warmer. We don't know.
All depends on the jet stream. When it comes to that, we have to remember that the shall we say, the interlinking effect of how climate changes is based on the actual fluctuation of cosmic radiation in the interstellar medium. And obviously our solar system is actually moving through a part of what we call the Milky Way galaxy. So when you get into...
That's debatable for some.
It is.
As we know, but some people don't believe that. But whatever, we are affected by the sun. Let's just put it that way. We don't, I do believe we live in the universe, but there could be another type of universe that people see it as, but the sun certainly exists as an energy form.
Yeah, so the cosmic radiation then affects the solar cycles. It affects the heliopause, the heliosphere of the sun. That affects its actual sunspot activity. That in turn affects the magnetic field around planet Earth. That in turn affects the jet streams, and that dictates, whether you have high pressure, low pressure, cold air fronts, and so forth. It dictates the size, to some extent, really, of the glacial sheeting and the ice caps in the Arctic North Polar region and the Antarctic South Polar region. We also have to remember, just as a side note, that we know the Antarctic continent was once highly fertile because archaeologists have found the remains of thousands of palm trees there. We also know that they found pyramids, the remnants of Antarctican pyramids there. So there must have been some kind of civilization. This is pure speculation, but I'll put this out there as a question. Was the Antarctic continent originally connected to the civilization of Lemuria that existed, in the Pacific Ocean many thousands of years ago? Just putting it out there as a question. Yeah. So we look back to Hyperborea, how that eventually went from being a unified civilization, and these Nordic Hyperboreans then literally that fragmented into smaller societies and communities, and then you had the arising of these smaller Hyperborean kingdoms. You then see, going on through many centuries of time, eventually the arising of the civilization of Scythians, and on the Pontic-Caspian steppes in in southern Russia and northern Ukraine. And then you can see then after they demise the arising of Great Tartaria. So trying to simplify it all down, don't want to get into really too much more on what caused the destruction of, for example, the
all in the previous videos we've done. Put a lot of shorts up, everyone, so you can always see little clips on them as well.
Yeah, we have gone in. We did it in a previous Sacred Wisdom podcast as to what caused the destruction of the Scythian civilization. So that is out there, and how Tartaria arose as a civilization. But so what we see is these cultural influences, literally probably on almost a genetic level, because obviously you go from the Nordic Hyperboreans, they were really the forefathers and the foremothers of the Scythian Aryans. The Scythian Aryans were experts in metallurgy. They were experts in goldsmithing, silversmithing. They were experts in equestrian, management. They were just really quite unique individuals. And much of that proficiency also would have then been transferred into the collective mindset on a cultural level amongst the Nordic Tatarians in northern Russia. So you can see animal husbandry, the use of music, the use of crystals, all very much part of a transitional cultural influence that went from, the time of the Hyperboreans to the time of the Scythian Aryans into the time of the Tartarians. So we can see this very clearly. And I think one of the reasons, that nobody really wants to discuss even the idea that the civilization of Hyperborea was actually authentic, was therefore real, is because if you accept it, a Western science says, look, okay, we're going to take this seriously. We're going to send teams of field archaeologists out to these areas. We're going to go out to the Kola Peninsula and then amongst a blast of northwestern Russia. We're going to send teams of archaeologists up into the polar Urals and the northern Urals in the Yamalo-Nenets autonomous Okrug of north central Russia. And then we're going to go out. I know what we'll do. Let's just go out into the Russian far east of Siberia, in northeastern Russia and the Kamchatka Peninsula, all around there, and see if we can find the remains of Hyperborean pyramids. And of course, if they did it properly in an objective way, they would find that, as Russian archaeologists have already found. But Western science does not want to accept that there was some kind of Arctic North Polar region based civilization that we can call Hyperborea, where there was an eternal spring, which really meant there was a 12-month all year round temperate climate. There wasn't sub-zero temperatures. They didn't have a distinct 12-month period with spring and summer and autumn and winter. We know that the Hyperboreans, were connected to what were known as the Hyperborean giants, or the Cyclopean giants of Hyperborea. So we have to postulate the idea, were the actual forefathers and foremothers of the Nordic Hyperboreans, were they 12 foot to 14 foot high, Hyperborean giants?
Well, it's very possible that we had very big giants on this planet once, and over 30 feet tall. I mean, there's little remains of evidence of that, almost like just look at the size of the doorways on the Egyptian temples and stuff. So it's all there.
But then we have to remember, I was just going to say, we have to also remember that, look at this co-collaborative process and relationship that seemingly existed in Great Tartaria, where we have these red-headed and red-bearded, pale white complexions, giants, Tartarian giants, male and female giants that were clearly at least 10, maybe 12 feet tall in many of these different woodcuts and paintings, standing and chatting away or conversing with average height looking Nordic Tartarians. So again, look at this pattern, so we have the white giants of Hyperborea. We have the Nordic Hyperboreans. You go to the Scythian civilization, and there are many accounts from the various Turkic tribes of Central Asia and parts of northern Russia that describe the actual Scythians as having pale complexions, and many amongst them had red hair and red beards and were at least 9 to 11 feet tall.
Wow.
So it appears there were Scythian giants that worked alongside the Scythian Aryans on the Pontic Caspian steppes in southern Russia and northern Ukraine. You also have the Tartarian giants and their genetic connections to the white giants of North America, that many of the Native Americans actually encountered on a regular basis for many, many aeons of time, especially in the United States of America, much more so than I'd say in Canada. So there are a lot of connections there. So if you accept the idea that possibly Hyperborea is a civilization, the Arctic North Polar region, including and therefore northern Russia, actually did exist, you then have to then open that door a bit further and then start to question, well, if that civilization existed, it couldn't have just fallen into demise and collapsed and nothing arose from it. What happened to the populations? What happened to the communities of survivors? What happened to those Nordic Hyperboreans? Well, of course, we know they Hyperborea fragmented into the Hyperborean kingdoms.
Yeah.
These various kingdoms then really were from where the civilization of the Scythians arose, albeit obviously the Scythians' culture was very much regressed. And perhaps there'd been some initial loss of their awareness of the occult technology that had been so prevalent in Hyperborea, as with the Shining Pyramids and the Crystal Pyramids that, evidently seem to have been constructed with some prevalence across places like the Kola Peninsula and the Murmansk Oblast of northwestern Russia, and obviously the Polar Urals, the northern Urals in north central Russia, and across the Kamchatka Peninsula in northeastern Russia. But again, Western science, and obviously that includes the Smithsonian Institution and Oxford University, Cambridge University, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and so on and so on. All of them are just going to deny that there's any validity to the idea. That
so it's very, with the giants, do you think they fled in? Like, there's a lot of talk with the deep underground military bases that giants work within some of these bases.
That's right. Yeah.
And do you think they were kind of connected to Scythia and part of the ancestry of that?
I think they were. I think that the giants that once existed, these Hyperborean giants, the Scythian giants, the Tartarian giants, I think they were highly empathic, most of them, very sensitive, very psychic, and very telepathic. And I don't think I don't think personally that there was any problem between them and most human beings at all. I think certain events were put into play on this planet where humans were put against the giants and then conflicts arose. Now, who and what caused that, again, is open to massive speculation. But, well, as it's speculation, let's speculate a bit on that.
Let's speculate. Come on, let's speculate.
So let's have a look at this. Okay, so we touched on the idea of these negatively based ultra-terrestrials or extraterrestrials, and we have discussed that at length in previous Sacred Wisdom podcasts. So we don't need to go into that again. People can go back through and they can watch those if they want any information on the specifics of that. But I would say that it makes sense if you're trying to covertly take over, say, a location like planet Earth, that you would try and fragment down the unity of civilizations. You would try and prevent the use of Christ consciousness. You would try and prevent the use of crystals as a form of healing and the use of music.
People, Christ consciousness is higher consciousness. All right. So understand there's been a lot of inversion put on what that actually is. So if you want to research that, please look at the channel or go and find out for yourself, because we've been disconnected from this higher consciousness, and that's what Stephen means by Christ consciousness.
That's right. Yeah. So for those of you out there, what Zach has just said is correct. It's a universal belief system. And again, I'm not going to go back into discussing, the billions of planets and moons out there in the Milky Way galaxy, let alone the trillions that exist across the physical universe, where Christ beings incarnate Christ being will come along to spiritually upgrade the actual supernal potential, the esoteric potential, and the spiritual integrity of those populations on those planets and moons across this physical universe, let alone probably countless alternate universes. But coming back to what we were saying, so that sense of cultural influence was so strong on a genetic and on a spiritual level. And you've got to remember that, as we've discussed quite a lot previously, many individuals, would have reincarnated. So the soul personalities of many of the inhabitants of Hyperborea would have decided to reincarnate as Scythian Aryans on the Pontic-Caspian steppes in southern Russia and northern Ukraine.
Do you feel they had that ability to know that? So when they actually left this life, they could actually direct where their soul went to in the next life?
Because I think in the past, you look at Tengrism, which is the indigenous shamanic religious beliefs of the Mongolians. You look at really much of Tibetan Buddhism. You look at really much of the studies by many clinical hypnotherapists in the last 40 to 50 years, not just in the United States of America, but in Canada, in reference to the idea that as somebody's nearing the point of death, you can steer your own human consciousness and actually, especially those who are very aware of themselves, who've done a lot of inner psychological healing over many years and meditation and prayer work and detoxing, to really say on a deep subconscious level that they positively intend that when they reincarnate, that they want to be a Pacific individual in a Pacific location, in a Pacific timeline. So I do believe that people were far more aware of that. They didn't have the electromagnetic distractions of television and radio and the internet that we do today. Yes, they had much more advanced forms of occult technology. They had free energy systems. They were able to draw down boundless quantities of telluric electricity for lighting and heating purposes, both in the civilization of Hyperborea and in the civilization of Great Tartaria in northern Russia. But the key point here is their integrity was kept, and the soul personalities of those Nordic Hyperboreans would have reincarnated, as Scythian Aryans, and many of those individuals would have reincarnated as these Tartarian Aryans in northern Russia to continue that process of self-learning and to resolve any issues. And I just
think it's so interesting if we just bring it into now. You look at the substances that are legal in this society, with societies all over the world. We have sugar, alcohol, tobacco, some very dangerous substances that will block these ways to actually connect to the higher consciousness, this astral way. The chemicals in food, particularly, and water, what we have, these are all stopping us and blocking us getting to a point where we can connect to that higher consciousness. I think it's so obvious but yet people like to remain blind. You really only have to walk around a supermarket to see. And really, 99% of the stuff we have in society of products and things that are made are pointless. They pull us into situations, dramas, things we don't actually need to know about. And it makes complete sense, Steve. And I find that fascinating that they were able to direct the next life. That's incredible. And I'd imagine the American Indians had this as well. They knew this.
That is correct. They did. And they would pass on sacred knowledge. And at the point of death, they would ensure that those individuals amongst the various Native American tribes could reincarnate amongst the same tribes again to pass on further knowledge. So it wasn't just a case of the elders, the chieftains of each group of American Indians having the ability to have the supreme knowledge over whatever American Indian tribe they were governing. It was also the case that knowledge was shared amongst different relatives, and the idea of reincarnating to pass on that knowledge again was seen as immensely important. So The same thing went on with the civilization of Hyperborea in the Arctic North Polar region. And, I think it's very interesting also to look at people like the Inuit Eskimo and the Yapik Eskimo. You look at their own folklore in regard to their own origins, and they even discuss the idea that they once lived in a luminescent realm far below the surface of planet Earth. But there were connections between that world. We can say, was that the hollow Earth? Was that the inner world? Putting it out there, it's obviously speculating on that, but then you have to also look at their folklore of the Inuit Eskimo and the Yapik when they're discussing how there were connections between this subterranean shining kingdom, or whatever you want to call it, or luminescent kingdom, and various northern lands where there was tremendous amounts of fertility. And they talk about, literally in parallel with the Greek myth of the eternal spring in Hyperborea, the idea that the nighttime was literally full of beautiful colors and was brightly radiating all the time with certain subtle light. And it wasn't directly coming from, obviously, the sun. So we then have to then postulate the idea, was this fertile northern kingdom that they're referring to, was that Hyperborea? And were they referring to the Aurora Borealis or the North Dawn?
Well, it's very possible. There really does seem to be something going on North and South Pole. And they are of great interest, these areas, to authorities, governments, all different types of people, billionaires as well. They tend to like to go down there. The Antarctic Treaty is so interesting as well. The way you have a peace treaty in that area.
If you look at the idea that over many aeons, the Nordic Hyperboreans who resided in the Arctic North Polar regions experienced the wonders of the eternal spring and the eternal light, not only was that an incredible idea to consider, but then you take a look at the fact their fertile meadows and fields were capable of producing a dual harvest of cereal grains. That means every 6 months throughout the 12-month period, with less than 50% of the toil that is usually required in the agricultural expanses of mainland Greece. Now, this has obviously come from Greek mythology itself, but has been sort of, shall we say, it's been rewritten in more a logical way to explain that. We had to remember that most of Hyperborea was left very wild and rustic, with vast numbers of different tree and shrub species growing everywhere. And then the Nordic Hyperboreans did not have to intensely toil for the harvesting of their meadows and fields. Instead, they were using a type of electroculture based on transmissions from the shining pyramids and the crystal pyramids to actually accelerate the growth of the fruits and the vegetables and cereal crops they had growing around them. So again, we look at the Kola Peninsula and the Murmansk Oblast of northwestern Russia, the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug of the Polar Urals and the Northern Urals in north-central Russia, and the Kamchatka Peninsula of northeastern Russia, where so many of these Hyperborean pyramids have been constructed and where so many remains have been found by Russian archaeologists. That's because the climate in those areas was radically different going back thousands of years. So
makes complete sense. And as you can see now, we're having huge climate shifts going on around the planet. Please look into that. There's lots of things happening. Well, it's nice to see now we're having electroculture brought back. There is this uprising of these technologies, there seems to be. So we are regaining this information. The interesting thing is now we've got the internet as well. So it makes it, it changes the whole kind of dynamics of it, really, doesn't it?
Yeah. It does. So it does. So when you look at how the cultural influence of electroculture, literally was transferred from the civilization of Hyperborea by using these shining pyramids or crystal pyramids that had these granite bases and quartz capstones, to the arising of electroculture in Great Tartaria in northern Russia, there again we have a correlation. It's interesting how, because of the regressed nature of the culture of the Scythians, much of that kind of occult technology was lost they didn't actually develop the kind of infrastructure to actually continue the use of electroculture in farming practices. And this is also, we have to remember, there was very little in the way of mainstream farming going on amongst the Scythian Aryans. They were known as nomadic. They were pastoral, they were nomadic. So they were living almost in the remnants of the Hyperborean kingdoms that had been in northern Russia. They had obviously then migrated into southern Russia and to northern Ukraine, and they were literally experts in equestrianism. They were fantastic metalsmiths. They understood really beautiful forms of scientific endeavor, but they didn't have any understanding in how to reconstruct the Hyperborean pyramids that had existed across northern Russia. They didn't really understand how to use electricity in the form of telluric energies being drawn down from the atmosphere, and they certainly didn't understand how to use electroculture to accelerate the actual rate of growth of fruits, vegetables, and cereal crops, and also to increase their size at the same time for harvesting purposes. So that's interesting how that then re-emerged later on with the arising of the civilization of Great Tartaria. So there's a lot of different cultural influences that were transferred through. It seems to be that when it comes to the Scythians, they would have been literally riding on horseback, with their beautiful gold work and silver work, their armor, their swords, their shields. It must have been quite incredible, in the sunlight, seeing all the armor they were wearing and, sparkling in the light. But I have in my mind, what I see is that these equestrian-based nomadic Scythian Aryans, who were literally the genetic inheritors of the Hyperborean kingdoms, they must have been literally riding past the remains of these shining pyramids and crystal pyramids. They'd have created various temporary encampments. We do know there were various permanently based cities that the Scythians did construct, but their cities didn't have even rudimentary occult technology when it came to the use of telluric electricity or the use of capacitors or any kind of distributor network to actually draw that telluric electricity down and to use it for lighting and heating. So it's, when we look back into prehistory, the trauma that can occur from the destruction of more advanced civilizations, such with obviously what happened on the Atlantean continent, the islands of Atlantis, and the traumatic fallout that occurred from that. The same kind of process, I would say, took place with the destruction of the Hyperborean kingdoms. It wasn't a temperate climate in northern Russia anymore. So once all that started to happen, everybody started moving into southern Russia. Perhaps some of the actual Nordic Hyperboreans moved into Eastern Asia. That was known historically as Cathay or Oriental Tartaria. That became then eventually Western China. So
do you think, look, just philosophically, like when I look at these subjects and I see that we had this advancement in the past, do you feel that almost like we had to reset that to understand something, that we need to relearn and re-understand? Because we've discussed it a lot, but all this is coming back. I don't care the way people see the world as doom and gloom and, whatever's going on in the world. I don't look at it like that, nor does Stephen. We see a bright future and we actually see this eventually breaking through. But obviously all this is darkness that we have in the world has been left dormant for such a long time that it's got to rise up. And there's been a lot of people that have ignored all this and have been sucked into all these kind of different psyops and all sorts of different situations that they're not even aware of. But do you feel like in the reset that we have to reset these like world situations, almost like reset the mind to relearn and reintegrate it? And it really, that our life journey is only about remembering. We already know all this stuff and we just have to reignite it in our souls. I'm interested in how positively this affects our soul journeys. All right. So I'm looking at it like that. And I think it's the best way to look at it, really.
So when you understand that, all quantum physicists are now talking about this, is that consciousness surpasses the biological death process. So that means every thought, every experience that any individual, Homo sapien or human being on planet Earth has had during that particular incarnation that they've chosen to have for specific experientiality reasons, therefore takes all that knowledge with them. So when they reincarnate elsewhere, that soul personality in that new biological form, who knows, it could be an individual that reincarnates on an outpost on one of the moons of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, or Neptune in this solar system, or even further out, on a planet or moon orbiting Proxima Centauri or somewhere.
And you see how science has cut us down to a belief system where we are looking up at the sky and we're told that they haven't found life yet in our solar system and galaxies. It's shocking.
It is. It's always the same. It's so. But what we're looking at is the fact that individual's memories, everything that they are in that specific incarnation, goes with them. So none of it is lost, none of it is erased or deleted at the point of death, because their consciousness surpasses the biological death process. It moves outside linear space-time because it's actually part of the soul. So when a human being exists, the mind is the interface between the physical, sensorial, interactive, material dimension that we're in, and it's therefore interfacing and processing different forms of experientiality that the soul personality requires for its long-term development. And that long-term development isn't obviously just focused just on that one incarnation. It's focused on perhaps incarnating 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, maybe even up to 100 or 200 times over thousands of years in all over the place, not just on planet Earth. So it's so vast, so intricate, so complex to understand how wondrous the eternal mind of the universal creator of heaven and earth is, and how this whole divine creation, the soul of creation, is formed, is maintained, and consistently, boundlessly resonating outwardly from the eternal mind of the universal creator. We can't really comprehend how vast, how awesome, how incredible, how awe-inspiring this all is. When we look at what was going on in the civilization of Hyperborea in the Arctic North Polar region, they had a long-term golden age or golden period, just as the civilization of Atlantis had done. They were separate civilizations. I'd say the civilization of Hyperborea was far larger, obviously, because it covered land masses such as Greenland and Iceland, Spitsbergen, and northern Russia, and obviously that included all the Arctic Russian islands, and it also included obviously the Arctic continent. Is vast in size, and the land masses were a lot larger than they are today. As I explained earlier in this Sacred Wisdom podcast, obviously there were huge climatic events and atmospheric upheaval, volcanic activity, and so forth that took place. So, but even with all that, so many of the cultural influences were passed on. And one of the key things, as I mentioned earlier, was really music. Amongst the Scythian Aryans, a lot of that was preserved. I mean, a lifestyle where you're living out on the Pontic Caspian steppes, of southern Russia and parts of northern Ukraine is not the most ideal way to live your life. And so music was a great form of healing and comfort for those Scythian Aryans. And, quite incredible when you think back how all these different human beings over time have lived their lives and the rise and fall of these civilizations. So I think I've pretty much covered everything I want to say on this.
When you said about the harp, and I imagine the cherubs you have, and it's interesting how they're often depicted at top of buildings.
Yeah, the golden lyres or the golden harps of Hyperborea were apparently vast in size. They were huge. And there was different sized golden lyres or golden harps, some of which were at least 8 feet in height and had to be played with the male or female Nordic Hyperborean actually standing on some kind of step or stool to play it. And there was different ones, some of which were around 6 feet tall, some 4 feet tall, some only 2 feet tall. And they all created different specific harmonic patterns, and they were used for specific reasons, and they were positioned in the actual divine temples of Hyperborea. They were positioned in key locations to create the most effective types of resonance and acoustic patterns that were needed in those actual buildings. And that somehow, in terms of the occult technology, was interconnected to the shining pyramids or the crystal pyramids of Hyperborea in the Arctic North Polar region. So there must have been some kind of complex interaction that was used between the use of music, cymatic-based healing, and obviously the crystals and the various luminescences that were all working together, functioning together, resonating together to create a specific optimal level of medical and biological restoration for the health of these Nordic Hyperboreans. Music was used for a similar purpose by the Scythian Aryans, and of course we've discussed in great detail in previous episodes of the Sacred Wisdom podcast. We have to remember that when it comes to Great Tartaria, the healing temples in their various towns and cities were places where this type of cymatic-based occult technology that was really centered on the use of different types of musical instruments, the use of tuning forks as resonators, the use of giant metallic pipe organs, all of which were used to interact with the different colored wavelengths of the quartz crystal and the stained glass windows of these healing temples. We can see that this was the summation of the cultural influences that had come from initially, obviously, the Scythians, but the Scythians themselves had obviously been culturally influenced by the actual, the occult technology of the Nordic Hyperboreans.
Brilliant, Steve. Well, thank you, my brother. It was amazing. And, you know, the fascinating really got me was when you were talking about people projecting their lives after death. And that particularly is, you know, a great mystery for me. I've always been interested in the afterlife and what there is there. I've had some experiences in my life, like I know you have. We've got a lot of experience we've both had, but just with regarding the afterlife is that we have access to intuitive knowledge all around us, and we can get to that knowledge instantly without even picking up a book. A lot of people don't realize
etheric records, basically.
Etheric records, thank you. Yes.
You can refer to the etheric records really as the library of God or the library of the universal creator.
Yeah.
Every individual soul personality, whether it was contained in a body of a Nordic Hyperborean, a Scythian Aryan, or a Nordic Tartarian, or whoever, every individual soul personality incarnates for different experiential purposes and reasons. Now, what they are is individual only to those specific soul personalities, you know, regardless of clinical hypnotherapy and so forth. What we have to understand is that as all knowledge in the mind of each individual surpasses the biological death process, every thought, every memory, every experience is literally uploaded into the eternal mind of the universal creator. So the universal creator is constantly knowing itself through the ever increasing diversity of experiential understanding and discernment that literally trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of soul personalities actually incarnate to experience, you know, and they're not all incarnating these types of soul personalities into the bodies of Homo sapiens or human beings. We have to remember that there are so many different life forms. I'm talking advanced life forms here, whether they are ultra-terrestrials or they are extraterrestrials. Some people may refer to them as intraterrestrials. That's obviously, shall we say, alien life forms that live permanently live inside different planets and moons.
Yeah.
Putting that aside, we have to understand that this whole process is so far beyond the comprehension of most individuals that all we can do is focus on our own personal lifestyles, our own incarnations, and do the very best we can Yes, there is going to be the arising of a new golden age or golden period. I've discussed it before. It's not going to happen for a few years, but it is going to happen in the very near future. So, any time from around 2034, 2035 onwards, round about, and that's an approximate duration, but it is around that time. So there's a lot of changes that need to take place amongst human beings on planet Earth now, just as there was with the Nordic Hyperboreans, as with the Scythian Aryans and the Nordic Tartarians. The same thing is happening now. What's happening is the collective shadow, as Carl Gustav Jung really discussed, needs to be brought to the surface, and it's down to humanity to do that do itself a good service and actually resolve that collective shadow and actually bring it out into the daylight and actually look at that and do some collective and individual healing. So but coming back to what we're saying, the cultural influences were so strong and they were passed on by those soul personalities who had incarnated firstly in the civilization of Hyperborea. Many of those soul personalities then reincarnated in the biological forms of what we call Scythians, who were types of Aryans. Mm-hmm. And the same thing then happened, obviously, with Great Tartaria in northern Russia. So knowledge was passed on. Obviously, not every soul personality from every civilization reincarnates in another civilization to pass on the maximum amount of occult technology, so to ensure it doesn't get lost. A lot of different soul personalities reincarnate elsewhere in the Milky Way galaxy. They might reincarnate elsewhere on planets.
I think that depends on the programming that happens
other parts of the physical universe.
Yeah. And I think that's dependent on the programming in their life and where they release that information and knowledge. And, obviously in a place of trauma, when people, which seems to be a case over the catastrophes and things that have happened over the planet, if you're caught in a state of trauma, that would probably be quite difficult to ascend. So you'll probably loop back round. And
it depends on the intensity of the trauma.
Yes.
Many soul personalities, you take a look, for example, what happened in World War II. From the 1st of September 1939 to the 8th of May 1945, it's known that many of the soul personalities that were involved in that horrific conflict did not want to reincarnate again on planet Earth. They did not come back. They went elsewhere. And you find that with many millions of Homo sapiens or human beings here on planet Earth, they don't want to reincarnate here. They find it too much. And you've also got to remember that from the perspective of many of the more benevolent ultra-terrestrials or extraterrestrials, many of who might be part of a galactic federation or galactic council, for want of a better phrase, they know that when any soul personality chooses to incarnate on planet Earth, it's a huge emotional challenge, and it's classed as being very brave to do that, because they know that being a human being is a very, very challenging and very tough thing to be for many individuals. And many individuals don't make it to old age. They find it overwhelming and too traumatic. So then they exit this world. The soul personality decides to leave.
Yeah. And them challenges, as hard as they are, especially now, and people need to understand, and like Stephen said, there is a golden age coming, but we do need to understand that we have to prepare ourselves mentally and spiritually for the next few years, because there are situations and upheavals that will happen, and we have to stay focused. And number one, and we have to do, is switch off that media, switch off external media that is giving you, feeding messages and negativity, or propelling the mainstream media as well. As much as the alternative media, there's some interesting stuff in there. There is a lot of alternative media that propels what the message is, and just is an echo chamber to the mainstream. So, and it's very interesting that, like, people need to understand that vibrationally, the ego's going, the ego is leaving, and maybe already left the planet, to be honest, that kind of egoic consciousness, and is still remaining. That's the kind of psychopathic nature of people that we have at the moment. They're almost like burning out that last egoic process. But that is the only thing that will weight you down. So you want to know, like, and bring, as Stephen was saying, bring that knowledge into the higher consciousness, the next level, the next stage of your life, your journey, your reality, your soul journey that you're on. Stephen, thank you, my brother. It was absolutely amazing. It's blown my mind. That I am buzzing with thoughts and ideas, as always, as all our conversations. So you can also see some of this information in our book, which we've both written. It's called Mysterious Realities. You can purchase that on Amazon, and that is available in ebook and paperback. You can also purchase on the links below on my website. Thanks, Steve. And it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.